staunch old souls of ethical culture. And since I'm not introducing him, I won't tell you that he's a honcho at another society in New Jersey, or that he's taught countless college classes in and outside of the U.S., or that he runs a shelter system for asylum seekers, or that he has, 4, 5 wonderful children? 6. And they're very accomplished, and Joe is one of our very favorite speakers. I'll just say that Joseph F.G.H., what's your middle initial?
N.
Huh?
N.
N is in Nancy.
N is in Nancy. Joseph Nancy Chuman, PhD, will now address us on culture wars, demagoguery, and a search for hope.
Thank you, Andrew, for that warm non-introduction. I can only be amused that you refer to me as an old honcho. It was just yesterday I was one of the young Turks of the ethical movement. It seems like it was almost yesterday, but I've been professionally involved, gee whiz, since 1969. So it's beginning to feel like a career. I'm very thankful for your sort of lead-in question that you wanted people to engage as they socialize, because it's precisely what I want to talk about this morning and more. I want to talk about our political moment, which I think has not only gone off the rails, but is also extremely dangerous.
Yes.
I begin my address this morning by looking at one episode in our movement's 140-year history. In the decade following World War II, fear of communist subversion on American soil was raised to the level of national hysteria. The Red Scare of the post-war years led to the persecution of untold numbers in and outside of government. Lawyers and teachers, sailors and steelworkers and social workers lost their jobs. Hundreds of screenwriters and actors and directors were smeared with the slander of being communists or fellow travelers and were laid off. Loyalty boards investigated millions of federal workers, inquiring as to which books they read, which civic associations they belonged to, and whether they went to church. More than 39 states passed laws requiring teachers and other public workers to take loyalty oaths. The House Un-American Activities Committee and a committee headed by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy held very zealous hearings to identify and to root out alleged communists plotting subversion against the U.S. government and promoting their communist propaganda. We might consider it a point of pride that the ethical culture movement was among those caught up in the sprawling net of McCarthyism. That ethical culture would be targeted by McCarthy is totally reasonable. Arguably, the Red Scare emerged out of the Depression that gave rise to critiques of capitalism and spawned the old left, which flourished in the 1930s among intellectuals and social activists. No doubt a good number of these lefties found a home right here in the Ethical Culture Society. The most prominent of them, as cited by Andra, the most prominent of them was Algernon D. Black, a leader of the New York Society, who was a very outspoken social democrat. Among other things, Black was a labor activist who organized striking silk workers in Lodi and Paterson, New Jersey. He was also heavily involved in racial justice and promoted integrated housing, as well as serving as a vice president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Al Black's public profile made him a ripe target for McCarthyism. The Encampment for Citizenship, which Black founded with Nanny Politzer, a member of this society, with the active support of Eleanor Roosevelt before the dawn of the Civil Rights Movement, was a racially integrated summer camp program that trained young people in progressive community organizing. McCarthy himself attacked the encampment as a communist front organization. Al Black was the main focus in the ethical movement of anti-communist tirades. In fact, he himself was investigated by the FBI. But he was not the only one. Henry Newman, the leader of the Brooklyn Society and an identified socialist, came up against the local Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles, which tried to block his speaking at the Ethical Society there on the grounds that Henry Newman had served on a committee to raise funds to send food to Soviet children, and indeed was an associate of Al Black. Other leaders of ethical culture were tarred with guilt by association, which was a favorite technique of McCarthyite witch hunts. The reason I cite this is that we can be inspired, I think, by the fact that ethical culture was not silent in the face of these sneers and assaults. The movement courageously, I think, and indeed very early, spoke out exposing McCarthyism in the name of freedom at a time when there were few such independent voices. In the words of Howard Reyes, the historian of the movement, quote, "Giving voice to conscience without regard to consequence was not seriously threatened by the hysteria." It is to the credit of the movement that despite disagreements and in the face of loss of support, the voices of Black, Newman, Nathanson, who was also a leader in the New York Society, and others continued to be heard without censorship. Repressive government behavior was attacked from the ethical platform, on radio programs, and in the movement's publications, end quote. I cite this historical episode because in my view, the time has again emerged for ethical culture to have a voice for sanity in the face of demagoguery coming from very high places. Demagoguery which is spreading poison across the political landscape and seeping downward to pervade the tenor of American society. Not since the time of Joseph McCarthy have we witnessed such depravity in our political culture, replete with name-calling, the substitution of falsehoods for facts, and the scapegoating of identified groups who allegedly are harboring evil designs. This time, the boogeyman isn't communism, but terrorism, and the targeted groups are immigrants, refugees, Latinos and Muslims, gays, and women. While ethical culture cannot be partisan, I don't believe we can shirk facts for the sake of neutral purity. As we all know, the scapegoating is coming from the badly fractured Republican Party, which has virtually been taken over by extremist elements. What used to be referred to as, quote, the lunatic fringe, has tragically become normative in significant sectors of our political life. When it comes to political campaigning, I should mention in all fairness that there has never been a truly extensive golden age. Historians like to point out that the elections of 1796 and 1800, which pitted John Adams against Thomas Jefferson, were brimming with personal invective, most of it the invective hurled at Jefferson. Adams, for his part, was referred to as, quote, a blind, bold, crippled, and toothless man, end quote. Adams called Jefferson, in return, quote, a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father, end quote. Racism was rampant back then. Adams' attacks went on to say that if Jefferson were elected, quote, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will openly be taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distress. The soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. End quote. Okay. These are our founding fathers. A favorite trope back then was to identify Jefferson with the excesses of the French Revolution. His enemies branded him, quote, a French infidel, and worse. It wasn't John Kerry who was the first one being accused of looking too French, okay? Back at the beginning, Jefferson, who used to hang out in Paris, and he was a favorite among his French buddies, he was really a Francophile, right? And was suspect because the French Revolution, which started with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, turned on its own and swallowed its own children in the Terror. So the French Revolution was always sort of the boogeyman, and the fact that Jefferson hung out with the French and was much beloved and was considered part of the circle of French philosophes made him very suspect in many American circles. In fact, he was so beloved of France when he came back to Monticello, having served Secretary of State in Paris, and served in Paris. He came back to Monticello and not only brought a whole treasure trove of possessions and furniture and so forth, he actually brought with him a French chef to make sure that his meals would be prepared in the style in which he enjoyed. But, by contrast, there was also a time not so very long ago when those running for high office felt an obligation to appear intelligent, high-minded, and experienced, and believed that statesmanship indeed had a place in political life. FDR had great appeal to the working class, even though he came from an aristocratic background and had a patrician sensibility. He didn't try to be someone he wasn't. And John Kennedy, though not a genius, felt a need to project an image of intelligence. He never donned cowboy hats or pretended to be just folks in order to curry favor with the electorate. But now we have a politics that appeals primarily to emotions. In the 2008 election, the touchstone of electability, as you recall, was whom you would want to have a beer with, and finding favor in a candidate, quote, who is just like me. I mean, don't people in the electorate hold up a mirror to themselves and say, am I really qualified to be president of the United States? Should I be the touchstone and the standard of electability and competence in the political realm to be the leader of the free world? But being just like me became a standard for electability. In the current race, the pandering to emotions is tragically, and I conclude dangerously, inclusive of an appeal to base emotions. The most dangerous of these is the appeal to fear. And the surest way to exploit the fears of those whom you wish to rally around you is by scapegoating targeted others whom you can convince your followers are somehow out to do us harm. Sorry to be partisan again, but the Republican primaries have been reduced to a circus with little more than name-calling and fear-mongering vulgarity and obscenity worthy of a junior high school playground, while discussions of policy are thin to non-existent. It's the politics of mean and nasty. It is also very grotesque. And I must say that Trump rallies, and this gets news every day, with their violence, which is stoked by the candidate himself, are beginning to look, and I'm using this by analogy, I'm not being literal, analogously begin to have the feel of Nazi brown shirt assaults by room squads on people. It's a very unsavory, I mean, you have to get into what you call semiotics, sort of the study of symbols and so on, but it's a very bad, at least if we can look at it metaphorically, a very, very troubling image, to say the least. Far beyond the pale is these candidates who would be president, and as such, the prime exemplar to the world of American values, each outdoing each other as to who can employ torture more brutally than the next. Not only is this an appeal to fear, not far beneath the surface, I think, is an appeal to sadism. With this current campaign and the appeal to primordial emotions, we are staring, I believe, into the heart of darkness. And though they are a favorite whipping boy, the media, in my view, are not innocent in that they've exacerbated, I think, the superficiality. The media have exacerbated the superficiality of this campaign. They do so by reporting on the primaries as little more than horse races, conveying nonstop obsession with polls. What they should be doing, in my opinion, is exposing the demagoguery for what it is, okay? A debasement of our political culture and a severe threat to democracy that carries with it more than the smell of fascism, which is a movement, of course, founded on the marriage of powerful financial interests with an increasingly militarized state. Slandering Mexicans as criminals and rapists, promising to bar all Muslims from our country, invoking religion to demonize gays and at times degrade the status of women. My own governor in New Jersey, who recently dropped out of the race and intoxicated by his own self-importance and opportunism, now strives to be the warm-up act for Donald Trump, okay? When I thought Chris Christie couldn't sink any lower, he actually outdid himself. I mean, it really is disgusting. Personally, I don't like the guy. I mean, he's insulted friends of mine. I mean, I just don't. All right, I won't go. I mean, you're on the other side of the Hudson here. Right. And Christie, I should say, among other virtues, talks tough by declaring that he would ban all Syrians from the country, and to bring home his point, he said, including orphans under the age of 5. Boy, a strong leader indeed. All these pronouncements of false machismo, I think, again, pander to the worst of human impulses. They are especially dangerous when large sectors of the American population feels disenfranchised and left behind. The politics of fear is directed at an older, white, and mostly male cohort, which is anxious about that America is changing in ways that make them feel alienated, that the America they knew is not the America that they any longer live in. America is changing demographically and no longer looks or feels like the environment to which they have been accustomed. The modern younger workforce centered on the high-tech industries to a great extent seems oppressively foreign to them. If they lose their job, they can't retool or retrain to get another one. And many Americans are feeling the frustration of wage stagnation. They are working harder but are economically going nowhere, if not downward. Playing on the fears by scapegoating others is extremely divisive and, again, a very dangerous ploy. The world has too often witnessed too many atrocities that have begun exactly in this way, through the demonization and dehumanization of others. As mentioned at the very least, such an approach compromises our democracy, which is the form of governance which of course sustains our freedom. A well-functioning democracy is nurtured in the soil of an informed citizenry, whose intelligence leads them to weigh alternative points of view and contend with others who differ, but in a spirit that respects their humanity, even in the face of difference. Democracy is a deliberative process that calls for not only votes, but for good reasons, not only for an opinion, but for a rational argument on its behalf. Pandering to base emotions, reducing policy issues to crude slogans, and demonizing the other drains democracy of those fundamental values which are necessary not only for its flourishing, but for its very survival. It was Thomas Jefferson again who said, quote, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion." End quote. That is a beautiful rule of thumb for leadership, okay? I would say, would that were the case. When we compare that standard of democratic leadership with the leadership we witness in this election cycle coming from one of our major parties, I think we can only weep. Speaking personally, the current political culture causes me to fearfully countenance that the tissue of democracy is really very thin. Though I'm personally not an alarmist, I ask myself at times in my dark moments whether dynamics known and unknown are now converging to erode our democracy, eating away at its foundations, thus allowing a political condition to emerge which will replace democracy with authoritarianism. Okay, democracies have a lifespan. They come and they go. Again, I'm not being certain, I'm not being alarmist, the conditions just raise these very difficult, painful questions. Name-calling, insults, demagoguery, vapid slogans, scapegoating, misogyny, fear-mongering, anti-intellectualism. And when you thought the political culture could not debase itself any further, we have reached the point where political pronouncements are made that are totally unhinged from truth, truthfulness, basic facts, and reality itself. Without a scintilla of shame, candidates who want to be the leader of the free world with their hands on the nuclear button simply make it up. Whether pontificating that Obamacare destroys jobs as unemployment plummets to under 5%, or claiming to have seen a video of Planned Parenthood keeping a fully formed fetus alive with legs kicking and heart beating to harvest its brain, or having personally witnessed thousands of Muslims in Jersey City cheering as the Twin Towers fell, all of them untrue, when caught in these bald-faced lies, our presidential candidates simply persist in the lie while holding truth, honesty, and the American people, all of us, in contempt. The questions I want to ask is, how did our political culture sink so low? Okay? What are the forces that have in fact brought us to this point? And where can we look that holds any promise that reason, sanity, and moderation can be, in fact, restored to our political life. Needless to say, the causes that have fueled the devolution of our political culture are many and complex, and I can only explore several prevailing themes, but I'll give it a try. I root the degeneration of our political culture in two large overlapping phenomena, which we can trace back perhaps 50 years. The first is the increasing radicalization towards extremism of the conservative wing, the conservative movement in the Republican Party, beginning with the campaign of Barry Goldwater in 1964. The second is the so-called culture wars, which have exploited emotionally laden social issues and have badly fractured the country while diverting the electorate from broader policies aimed at enhancing the common good. Both of these phenomena have been centered on matters of race, have exploited issues of race and religion. Race and religion, I want to explain what I mean. The emergence of the Tea Party is the most significant expression of ultra-conservative extremism in today's Republican Party. It is responsible for shutting down the federal government, for innumerable efforts to overturn Obamacare, and for opposing any efforts towards mediation and cooperation with their political opponents, which they see as defection from their ideological purity. Such figures, and I'll name names, as Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, are darlings of the Tea Party, as well as a raft of congressional representatives who came in with the last mid-presidential congressional election. We might assume that this wave of extremism is a reaction against the presidency of Barack Obama. But if we peer more deeply, we can interpret the Tea Party's politics, I think, as a fulfillment, indeed, of Barry Goldwater's vision 50 years ago. Goldwater's platform called for radically reducing the federal government, for slashing social welfare programs, ending the graduated income tax, and containing the Soviet Union while risking war, and developing tactical battlefield nuclear weapons to be used on the battlefield, affirming, quote, that we would rather die than lose our freedom, end quote. Goldwater was assuredly an extremist. I well remember the mantra, as I'm sure you do too, and we can understand it quite literally, quote, I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. That was Goldwater's platform, okay, and he meant it. Goldwater was also a favorite of the John Birch Society, the grandfather of kooky extremist organizations with its penchant for conspiracy theories and seeing communists under every rock. And if we want to see, remember Dwight Eisenhower was accused of being a communist by the John Birch Society? I mean, how ridiculous can it be, right? I mean, today is not the only age where political claims are an inch from reality. Right? We have a very noble tradition in that regard. And if we want to see, and here I'll engage in a little conspiratorial thought myself, and if we want to see a similarity between then and now, one of the founders of the John Birch Society was Fred Koch, the father of David and Charles, who are currently bankrolling the Tea Party. Okay? But for our thesis, perhaps the most significant change Goldwater brought was the transformation of the Republican Party that centered on race. And I think that Barry Goldwater himself personally was not a racist. I will give him the benefit of the doubt, but he was a very staunch advocate of states' rights, which had been used as a cover politically to basically foment racism and preserve it. Not only did Goldwater's ideological extremism cause moderate Republicans to flee the party, his opposition to civil rights legislation, again on the basis of holding states' rights, delivered the Deep South in 1964 for the Republican Party, while many of the suburbs around the big northeastern cities, which were traditionally Republican territory, turned purple or blue. Goldwater won very few states in '64. I mean, it was a landslide for Lyndon Johnson, but he did win several states. I forget exactly. I mean, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, I think Georgia. He won about 5 states, and they were all in the very deep South. This realignment of the South becoming totally Republican was brought, however, to perfection by Richard Nixon and later Ronald Reagan in wielding the so-called Southern strategy. The strategy was significant, I believe, because it introduced, this is my point here, The Southern strategy was significant, I believe, because it introduced a very powerful element of emotional manipulation into political argumentation. The Southern strategy stoked the racial fears and prejudices of white Southerners with appeals to states' rights and law and order, which were really coded terms pointing to the growing encroachment of blacks into white society. With the Southern strategy, politics turns, as noted, from articulating principled positions to manipulating emotions and pandering to base fears. This approach was reinforced by Ronald Reagan, who campaigned defending states' rights, started his campaign, as you might recall, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, not far from the place where 3 civil rights workers had been slain. Again, it was an appeal to race, with states' rights as a stand-in for the way things were before integration. But before I move ahead with the discussion of race, I want to make a further observation about the evolution of the Republican Party towards greater extremism. Here I'm borrowing from the thesis put forward by the Washington Post journalist E.J. Dion in a recently published book entitled Why the Right Went Wrong. I read the book. It's a real doorstopper with more information than you actually want to know. It's chock full of details. In what is an extraordinarily detailed volume, Dion argues that conservatism has increasingly become more extreme and dysfunctional because Republican ideologues continually make promises to their constituents that they cannot keep. As Dion puts it, conservative leaders have promised a small government utopia which is impossible to achieve because the blandishments of Social Security and Medicare, it is an America which most Americans, including Republicans and conservatives, don't want. Okay. They have promoted an America with 1950s cultural norms and an ethnic makeup of the country in the 1940s, which are values in a demography which have long passed us by. These false promises, he argues, led to cycles of frustration, and with each cycle, the ideology of conservatism became increasingly more extreme. In Dion's own words, quote, "The Republican Party created Donald Trump because they made a lot of promises to their base and never kept them. It is a problem that goes a long way back. Since 1968, no conservative administration, not Richard Nixon's, not Ronald Reagan's, and neither of the Bush presidencies could live up to the rhetoric conservative politicians deployed to rally their supporters. Their appeals were rooted in the aspirations of the Goldwater movement that began shaping American politics 50 years ago. The hopes Goldwater inspired were regularly frustrated. In response, movement conservatives advanced an ever purer ideology, certain that doing so would eventually bring them the triumph that had eluded them over and over," end quote. Interesting analysis. In Dion's analysis, the emergence of the Tea Party is more a reaction, believe it or not, to perceived failed policies of George W. Bush than it is even to the rise of Barack Obama. Though from the left's perspective, Bush was critiqued as greasing the wheels of government to further enrich the corporations and bound down to a free market run amok. From the conservative viewpoint, he was actually seen as an advocate of, quote, big government, who is not conservative enough on issues of spending, immigration, education, and Medicare. Remember, Bush brought in the prescription drug plan that gave billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical, very much stuck in the craw of people who believed in him and felt as conservatives they were being sold out by the Bush administration. But I want to return to the issue of race and the role that race has played in fomenting the culture wars, which have served mightily to divide us and dumb down our politics, and has made it more small-minded. But the story about race and the culture wars is also a story about religion. When I speak about religion, what I have in mind is the politicization of Christian evangelical and fundamentalist Protestantism. In the late 1970s, the evangelical subculture, which since the Scopes trial of 1925 had been politically quietistic on the grounds that involvement with politics was spiritually corrupting, reversed itself and entered the political arena, or re-entered the political arena in full force. No, that's true. I mean, in the 19th century, evangelicals, who tended to be progressive, actually, and stood behind the abolitionist movement and so forth, with the coming of a Scopes trial, felt ridiculed and humiliated. And so they retreated from the political sphere, and it was not until the late 70s that they actually reemerged. A result has been, with their reemergence, has been that American politics has shifted far to the right as religious conservatives and ultra-conservatives have married themselves to the far right of the Republican Party. And as mentioned, they have also made our politics more fractious, partisan, and small-minded. Most people would assume that the entry of evangelicals into the political sphere was a reaction against the Roe v. Wade decision, which provided on a federal level the right to an abortion, the Roe v. Wade decision, 1973. But in fact, that's not true. You might find it surprising that some evangelical ministers and their magazines actually supported a woman's right to choose on church-state separation grounds. As you recall, most evangelicals in the United States are Southern Baptists. And Baptists historically, think Roger Williams in Rhode Island, actually had a pretty good position on church-state separation. And they saw abortion, many of them, before the late 70s, saw, in effect, a woman's right to have an abortion as a matter of privacy, and would defend it on the grounds of church-state separation. An interesting surprise, after the late 70s, of course, that was vehemently not true. Okay. The problems had to do with race. In great measure, the Christian right was born not out of the abortion issue, but was born out of an anxiety over racial mixing and a loss of white supremacy. Its emergence was, in fact, a delayed reaction against the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1964, which integrated our public schools. As a result of Brown, Southern evangelicals left the public schools in droves to found their own private segregated academies. These schools claimed tax exemptions as charitable institutions, and their numbers exploded after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. An interesting footnote here is that Hillary Clinton, as a 24-year-old law student, went undercover in 1972 for the Children's Defense Fund, which sent her to Alabama posing as a parent seeking to enroll her child as a student in one of these Christian academies. Her real task was to check out whether they were integrated or not, and then report back to Marian Wright Edelman, the director of the Children's Defense Fund, providing the substance for lawsuits attacking these white Christian academies on the grounds that they did not deserve a tax exemption. When Jimmy Carter became president in 1977, evangelicals were enthused that one of their own had actually made it to the White House. But in their view, Carter had betrayed them when he ordered the IRS to remove the tax exemption of these private academies on the grounds that they were racially segregated. The IRS also withdrew the tax exemption from Bob Jones University because it prohibited interracial dating. The consequences of this move by the Internal Revenue Service under Carter were monumental. Evangelicals abandoned Carter and shifted their allegiance to Ronald Reagan, a man who seldom went to church and whose religious commitments were somewhere between astrology and New Age. Okay? His religion made no difference, just as they're supporting, remarkably, Donald Trump, who's 3 times married, a womanizer, you know what I'm saying, and virtually never goes to church, and evangelicals are now backing out. I mean, religion is used as a front. Indeed, as I'd like to point out, abortion is the jewel in the crown of Christian right politics. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament do not say a word about abortion, absolutely silent. When they say Jesus forbids abortion, Jesus never said anything about abortion. And it's basically a Trump, can't use that word anymore. It's basically a fabricated political issue that has no religious warrant in Scripture, and yet among fundamentalists, it in effect is the jewel in the crown of the political rallying point. Thus was born, the point is, thus was born the marriage between evangelical Protestantism and the Republican Party. But even more significant was Jerry Falwell's creation of the moral majority in 1979 and the repoliticization of the huge evangelical subculture. As a result, the moral majority and its successor, Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition, along with a huge roster of other Christian action groups, have swung our politics far to the right and have succeeded in preoccupying politics with battles over such issues as abortion, busing, feminism, homosexuality, gay marriage, pornography, art, affirmative action, the place of religion in the public square, rock music, divorce, sex education, birth control, family values, creationism, drug use, secularism, the religion of the founding fathers, the literary canon, school prayer, and the legacy of the 1960s. Culture wars. While the religious right has in great measure determined the substance of much of our political debates, they have also scaled downward the tenor of our politics, and disastrously so. What I mean is that conservative and fundamentalist religion tends to be very anti-intellectual. And because of its influence in public and political life, it has added to a culture of unreason in American society. It has helped to undermine the authority of science, reason, and the appeal to evidence when making empirical assessments about the world. Its fascination with apocalyptic end-time scenarios, dividing the saved from the damned, has further polarized the American electorate and has influenced foreign policy, including the evangelicals' strange love affair with Israel and boosting the disastrous war in Iraq. And because the Christian right sees these issues as moral and moreover religious issues, they are put forward as matters of doctrine issuing from an unchanging and perfect God, meaning they are not subject to negotiation or compromise. There's a lot more we can say. But with the dual dynamic of the conservative movement spiraling towards greater extremism, and with fundamentalist religion so powerfully darkening our political landscape, space is opened up for the arrival of the fusion of celebrity and politics, personified by Donald Trump, and the frightening, unbending extremism of Ted Cruz. And Marco Rubio, by the way, is no better. If you look at his positions, they're as right-wing as Cruz's are, okay? Dark forces. And as we know, it is this extremism which has become the lodestar which all the other Republican candidates feel they have to emulate. Their emergence and the political culture they reflect are the end results of several long evolving processes. More proximate causes, we might say, of this downward momentum, one could argue fairly obviously, was the elevation of George W. Bush to the presidency, a man, despite his Yale education, has little interest in learning and knowledge, and is phenomenally an uncurious man. Add to this the selection of Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate, a person I think totally unsuited for high office. Bush and Palin paved the way to Donald Trump. But whereas they were creatures of the Svengalis who were their handlers, Trump is more fretful because he's a Frankenstein of his own making who cannot be controlled.
Yes.
Okay, that's why the establishment, not that he has no policy, that's not what concerns them. Okay, well, sometimes they make noises that he's not conservative enough. What it is, he's not controllable. Bush, indeed, was handled by Rove and Cheney and others, right? And Sarah Palin was malleable enough, right, with the conservatives standing behind him. Trump, by contrast, is his own man and is beyond the control of the so-called establishment. But given the horrendous political conditions, and I want to bring this to an end, given the horrendous political conditions we are in, is there any hope that the political culture may right itself and sanity, reason, and statesmanship will be restored? I ask these questions not only as a citizen who is deeply worried about our political future, but also as a progressive who sustains a vision of the America that I would want to live in. I believe that there is some reason for hope, and there isn't total darkness on the horizon. In a certain sense, and here I'm sort of repeating my thesis, one can argue that the extremism we see is a reaction against countervailing trends that lead to optimism about the future of our politics and American society more broadly. When it comes to the Republican Party, where political extremism resides, that extremism, as E.J. Dionne documents, is a reaction against prevailing progressive trends which have, in fact, overtaken American society. In other words, political reactionaries may dogmatically call for a smaller government and for the dismantling of entitlement programs. They rail against homosexuality and gay marriage, against women's empowerment and the right to choose, and a call for the restoration of idyllic family values circa 1950. But the truth is that America has moved on. The vast majority of Americans do not want to give up their Social Security or Medicare or other entitlements. Most Americans, I think, realize you can't run a huge modern country like the United States of America without a large federal government. A majority supports gay marriage, we know that, and still a majority supports a woman's right to choose, which remain the loss of the land. In short, the extremists are fighting lost causes. E.J.D.O., liberal though he is, he's a little bit to left of center, wants to see conservatism regain its balance, both for its own sake and because he feels that it has something valuable to add to the American political conversation and for the sake of our political culture as a whole. He is not sure it can reform itself, but he thinks that conservatives would be wise to jettison Barry Goldwater as its model and appropriate the moderate conservatism of Dwight Eisenhower. Progressive that I am, I guess I could live with that. I like Ike, right? Ike looks better, right? You make him better, right, as time moves on? Right, okay. Dwight Eisenhower should be the model. Remember we had a 91% income tax for the highest level? Not bad, right? In that regard, bring on Ike. Right. And when it comes to the culture wars, the same observation pertains. Though the right has almost always precipitated each of these cultural battles, it has almost always fomented the culture war after it has lost the cause that it's been fighting for. In other words, history has demonstrated that liberals have almost always won the cultural wars. Our conservative extremists may attack homosexuality, gay marriage, women in the workforce, the flying of the Confederate flag, etc. Pick the issue you want. But in almost all cases, the conservative cultural warriors are fighting lost causes. The only important exception to that, I'll mention that here to be fair to the facts, is the abortion issue, okay? It hangs, as you know, on one Supreme Court justice. And to be honest, in some places in the United States, looking at rural Texas, Roe v. Wade has de facto been overturned. In other words, it is so difficult for women to get abortions that it has been, right? But even so, when you poll Americans, a majority want to retain a woman's right to choose with some restrictions and qualifications. When I look at, let me just say this an aside, I guess I'm veering into partisanship that is too inappropriate from the platform, but when I look at Marco Rubio, who wants to ban a woman's right to choose in cases of incest and rape, I say to myself, there's maybe one or two countries in the world that take that position. And El Salvador is one of them. Guatemala may be the other. I don't know. And it's a position that is so far outside of global consensus, let alone American consensus, that it really is, extreme. Right? So my point is that liberals, in effect, have won the culture wars. But overall, there is an historical tendency in America, I think, for greater inclusion of those who at any moment may be spurned and hated. Mormons, Catholics, Asians, and other minorities were each at one point excluded from the American consensus, but in time they were absorbed into the American fabric, and I predict that this will be the fate of Muslims as well. Every year I'm invited to a huge Muslim gathering in northern New Jersey. Now, New Jersey, with the exception of Michigan, has the largest Muslim and Arab population in the United States. Many of them are centered around Patterson. And every year the American Muslim Union holds a huge breakfast, which I'm invited to. I can't go every year because it takes place at 11 o'clock on Sundays, but the food is great. And I'm always struck there are 500 Muslims and me and a few token others, and I'm always struck with it opens with the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States. They get the local congressman Pascrell to speak. They get some academic talking about the nature of democratic governance, and the opposition make in effect a definitive statement opposing terrorism and applauding good citizenship. And they almost always have a speaker from the FBI talking to this, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But my point is, just observing this large conclave of Muslims, they're behaving like every other immigrant group in America. that is trying to demonstrate and struggle to become, as it were, acculturated or assimilated, to the fabric of America. And I include that the liberal ethos of inclusion in time will make its peace with the Muslim population in this country. But, just to close here, perhaps the greatest sign of hope, I think, is a changing American demography. Polls consistently indicate that the so-called millennial generation, very well represented here today, is prevailingly liberal in its political outlook. The problem is they don't like religious congregations very much, or else we would probably be swelling with them. Is prevailingly liberal in its political outlook. It is certainly less religious, with more than 30% indicating now that they have, quote, no religion. In great measure, this move, I think, is a reaction to the intolerance younger Americans have witnessed in the politicized religion of the Christian right, and the millennials are driving a greater social liberalism, I think, among all Americans. Demography may not be destiny, but the conservative and far-right cohort in America is older and whiter in a country that is increasingly non-white, younger, and among the millennials, less conservative. Demography, again, may not be destiny, but it does present a cause for hope as we move into an unknown future. As humanists, of course, we cannot simply wait passively for a brighter future. If a saner, more rational politics is in store for our nation, then we must do our share to nudge it along. We need to be vigilant. We must be prepared to speak out against the politics of fear and denounce demagoguery and condemn those who spew prejudice and bigotry for the sake of political gain or for any reason. But on the positive end, we need to remain engaged in the political struggle to ensure that we help mold a society which is open and tolerant, fair and just, a society which honors the dignity of all people within its boundaries to the extent that our powers allow us, and what is best in us enable us to do so. As humanists, we must redouble our faith that perseverance in the service of what we believe to be right and humane, and indeed reason itself, however sullied in the moment, will at last have the final